This is the Voyage Out, Part 2. We'll get started on Part 2 today, and I hope you enjoy. Alright, guys. Boy, it's so weird with these filters if it's going to show or not. Probably not. The Voyage Out. Since they're going to go crazy anyway, why not just send insane people in the first place and save them the trouble? Said Michel Duval. He was only half joking. His position throughout had been that the criteria for selection constituted a mind-boggling collection of double binds. His fellow psychiatrist stared at him. "Can you suggest any specific changes?" asked the chairman, Charles York. "Perhaps we should all go to Antarctica with them and observe them in the first period of time together. It would teach us a lot." "But our presence would be inhibitory. I think just one of us will be enough." So they sent Michel Duval. He joined 150 odd finalists at McMurdo Station. The initial meeting resembled any other international scientific conference, familiar to them all from their various disciplines. But there was a difference. This was a continuation of a selection process that had lasted for years and would last another, and those selected would go to Mars. So they lived in Antarctica for over a year together, familiarizing themselves with the shelters and equipment that were already landing on Mars in robot vehicles, as cold and harsh as Mars itself, familiarizing themselves with each other. They lived in a cluster of habitats located in Wright Valley, the largest of Antarctica's dry valleys. They ran a biosphere farm, and then they settled into the habitats through a dark austral winter and studied secondary or tertiary professions, or ran through simulations of the various tasks they would be performing on the spaceship Ares, or later on the Red Planet itself, and always aware that they were being watched, evaluated, judged. They were by no means all astronauts or cosmonauts, although there were a dozen or so of each, with many more up north clamoring to be included. But the majority of the colonists would have to have their expertise in areas that would come into play after landfall: medical skills, computer skills, robotics, systems design, architecture, geology, biosphere design, genetic engineering, biology, also every sort of engineering, and construction expertise of several kinds. Those who had made it to Antarctica were an impressive group of experts in the relevant sciences and professions, and they spent a good bit of their time cross-training to become impressive in secondary and tertiary fields as well. And all their activity took place under the constant pressure of observation, evaluation, and judgment. It was necessarily a stressful procedure. That was part of the test. Michel Duval felt that this was a mistake, as it tended to ingrain reticence and distrust in the colonists, preventing the very compatibility that the selection committee was supposedly seeking. One of the many double binds, in fact. The candidates themselves were quiet about that aspect of things, and he didn't blame them. There wasn't any better strategy to take. That was a double bind for you. It ensured silence. They could not afford to offend anyone or complain too much. They could not risk withdrawing too far. They could not make enemies. So they went on being brilliant and accomplished enough to stand out, but normal enough to get along. They were old enough to have learned a great deal, but young enough to endure the physical rigors of the work. They were driven enough to excel, but relaxed enough to socialize. And they were crazy enough to want to leave Earth forever, but sane enough to disguise this fundamental madness. In fact, defend it as pure rationality, scientific curiosity, or something of the sort, which seemed to be the only acceptable reason for wanting to go. And so naturally they claimed to be the most scientifically curious people in history. But of course, there had to be more to it than that. They had to be alienated somehow, alienated and solitary enough not to care about leaving everyone they had known behind forever, and yet still connected and social enough to get along with all their new acquaintances in Wright Valley, with every member of the tiny village that the colony would become. Oh, the double binds were endless. They were to be both extraordinary and extraordinary at one and the same time. An impossible task, and yet a task that was an obstacle to their heart's greatest desire, making it the very stuff of anxiety, fear, resentment, rage, conquering all those stresses. But that too was part of the test. Michel could not help but observe with great interest. Some failed, cracked in one way or another. An American thermal engineer became increasingly withdrawn, then destroyed several of their rovers and had to be forcibly restrained and removed. A Russian pair became lovers, and then had a falling out so violent that they couldn't stand the sight of each other, and both had to be dropped. This melodrama illustrated the dangers of romance going awry, and made the rest of them very cautious in this regard. Relationships still developed, and by the time they had left Antarctica they had 3 marriages, and these lucky 6 could consider themselves, in some sense, safe. But most of them were so focused on getting to Mars that they had put these parts of their lives on hold, and if anything, conducted discreet friendships, in some cases hidden from almost everyone, in other cases merely kept out of the view of the selection committee. And Michel knew he was seeing only the tip of the iceberg. He knew that critical things were happening in Antarctica out of his sight. Relationships were having their beginnings, and sometimes the beginning of a relationship determines how the rest of it will go. In the brief hours of daylight, one of them might leave the camp and hike out to Lookout Point, and another follow, and what happened out there might leave its mark forever. But Michel would never know. And then they left Antarctica, and the team was chosen. There were 50 men and 50 women, 35 Americans, 35 Russians, and 30 miscellaneous international affiliates, 15 invited by each of the 2 big partners. Keeping such perfect symmetries had been difficult, but the selection committee had persevered. The lucky ones flew to Cape Canaveral or Baikonur to ascend to orbit. At this point, they both knew each other very well and did not know each other at all. They were a team, Michel thought, with established friendships and a number of group ceremonies, rituals, habits, and tendencies. And among these tendencies was an instinct to hide, to play a role and disguise their real selves. Perhaps this was simply the definition of village life, of social life. But it seemed to Michel that it was worse than that. No one ever before had had to compete so strenuously to join a village, and the resulting radical division between public life and private life was new and strange. Ingrained in them now was a certain competitive undercurrent, a constant subtle feeling that they were each alone, and that in case of trouble they were liable to be abandoned by the rest and yanked out of the group. The selection committee had thus created some of the very problems it had hoped to prevent. Some of them were aware of this, and naturally they took care to include among the colonists the most qualified psychiatrist they could think of. So they sent Michel Duval. At first, it felt like a shove in the chest. Then they were pushed back in their chairs, and for a second the pressure was deeply familiar. 1G, the gravity they would never live in again. The Ares had been orbiting Earth at 28,000 kilometers per hour. For several minutes they accelerated. The rockets pushed so powerful that their vision blurred as corneas flattened, and it took an effort to inhale. At 40,000 kilometers per hour, the burn ended. They were free of the Earth's pole, in orbit to nothing but the sun. The colonists sat in the Delta V chairs, blinking, their skin flushed, their hearts pounding. Maya Katarina Totoyevna, the official leader of the Russian contingent, glanced around. People appeared stunned. When obsessives are given their object of desire, what do they feel? It was hard to say, really, In a sense, their lives were ending, yet something else, some other life, had finally begun. Filled with so many emotions at once, it was impossible not to be confused. It was an interference pattern, some feelings canceled, others reinforced. Unbuckling from her chair, Maya felt a grin contorting her face, and she saw on the faces around her the same helpless grin. All but Sax Russell, who was as impassive as an owl, blinking as he looked over the readouts on the room's computer screens. They floated weightlessly around the room. December 21st, 2026. They were moving faster than anyone in history. They were on their way. It was the beginning of a 9-month voyage, or of a voyage that would last the rest of their lives. They were on their own. Those responsible for piloting the Ares pulled themselves to the control consoles and gave the orders to fire lateral control rockets. The Ares began to spin, stabilizing at 4 RPM. The colonists sank to the floors and stood in a pseudo-gravity of 0.38 G, very close to what they would feel on Mars. Many man-years of tests had indicated that it would be a fairly healthy G to live in, and so much healthier than weightlessness that rotating the ship had been deemed worth the trouble. And, Maya thought, it felt great. There was enough pull to make balance relatively easy, but hardly any feeling of pressure, of drag. It was the perfect equivalent of their mood. They staggered down the halls to the big dining hall in Taurus D, giddy and exhilarated, walking on air. In Taurus D's dining hall, they mingled in a kind of cocktail party, celebrating the departure. Maya wandered about, sipping freely from a mug of champagne, feeling slightly unreal and extremely happy, a mix that reminded her of her wedding reception many years before. Hopefully this marriage would go better than that one had, she thought, because this one was going to last forever. The hall was loud with talk. It's a symmetry not so much sociological as mathematic, a kind of aesthetic balance. We're hoping to get it into the parts per billion range, but it's not going to be easy. Maya turned down an offered refill, feeling giddy enough. Besides, this was work. She was co-mayor of this village, so to speak, responsible for group dynamics, which were bound to get complex. Antarctic habits kicked in even at this moment of triumph, and she listened and watched like an anthropologist, or a spy. The shrinks have their reasons. We'll end up 50 happy couples. And they already know the matchups. She watched them laugh. Smart, healthy, supremely well-educated. Was this the rational society at last? The scientifically designed community that had been the dream of the Enlightenment? But there was Arkady, Nadia, Vlad, Ivana. She knew the Russian contingent too well to have many illusions on that score. They were just as likely to end up resembling an undergraduate dorm at a technical university, occupied by bizarre pranks and lurid affairs. Except they looked a bit old for that kind of thing. Several men were balding, and many of both sexes showed touches of gray in their hair. It had been a long haul. Their average age was 46, with extremes ranging from 33, Hiroko Ai, the Japanese prodigy of biosphere design, to 58, Vlad Teniv, winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Now, however, the flush of youth was all on their faces. Arkady Bogdanov was a portrait in red, hair, beard, skin. In all that red, his eyes were a wild electric blue, bugging out happily as he exclaimed, "Free at last! Free at last! All our children are free at last!" The cameras had been turned off after Janet Blyleven had recorded a series of interviews for the TV stations back home. They were out of contact with Earth, in the dining hall anyway, and Arkady was singing, and the group around him toasted the song. Maya stopped to join this group. Free at last. It was hard to believe. They were actually on their way to Mars. Knots of people talking, many of them world class in their fields. Ivana had won part of a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Vlad was one of the most famous medical biologists in the world. Sachs was in the pantheon of great contributors to subatomic theory. Hiroko was unmatched in enclosed biological life support systems design, and so on, all around. A brilliant crowd. And Maya was one of their leaders. It was a bit daunting. Her engineering and cosmonautic skills were modest enough. It was her diplomatic ability that had gotten her aboard, presumably. Chosen to head the disparate, fractious Russian team with the several Commonwealth members. Well, that was okay. It was interesting work, and she was used to it. And her skills might very well turn out to be the most important ones aboard. They had to get along, after all. And that was a manner of guile and cunning and will. Willing other people to do your bidding. She looked at the crowd of glowing faces and laughed. All aboard were good at their work, but some were gifted far beyond that. She had to identify those people, to seek them out, to cultivate them. Her ability to function as leader depended on it, for in the end she thought they would surely become a kind of loose scientific meritocracy. And in such a society as that, the extraordinarily talented constituted the real powers. When push came to shove, they would be the colony's true leaders, they or those who influenced them. She looked around and located her opposite number, Frank Chalmers. In Antarctica, she had gotten to know him very well. A tall, big, swarthy man. He was talkative enough and incredibly energetic, but hard to read. She found him attractive. Did he see things as she did? She had never been able to tell. He was talking to a group across the length of the room, listening in that sharp, inscrutable way of his, head tilted to the side, ready to pounce with a witty remark. She was going to have to find out more about him. More than that, she was going to have to get along with him. She crossed the room, stopped by his side, stood so that their upper arms just barely touched, leaned her head in toward his, a brief gesture at their comrades. This is going to be fun, don't you think? Chalmers glanced at her. If it goes well, he said. After the celebration and dinner, unable to sleep, Maya wandered around through the Aries. All of them had spent time in space before, but never in anything like the Aries, which was enormous. There was a kind of penthouse at the front end of the ship, a single tank like a bowsprit, which rotated in the opposite direction the ship did, so that it held steady. Solar watch instruments, radio antennas, and all the other equipment that worked best without rotation were located in this tank. And at the very tip of it was a bulbous room of transparent plastic, a chamber quickly named the Bubble Dome, which provided the crew with a weightless, non-rotating view of the stars and a partial view of the great ship behind it. Maya floated near the window wall of this bubbled dome, looking back at the ship curiously. It had been constructed using space shuttle external fuel tanks. Around the turn of the century, NASA and Globkosmos had begun attaching small booster rockets to the tanks and pushing them all the way into orbit. Scores of tanks had been launched this way, then tugged to work sites and put to use. With them they had built 2 big space stations, an L5 station, a lunar orbit station, the first manned Mars vehicle, and scores of unmanned freighters sent to Mars. So by the time the 2 agencies agreed to build the Ares, the use of the tanks had become routinized, with standard coupling units, interiors, propulsion systems, and so forth, and construction of the big ship had taken less than 2 years. It looked like something made from a children's toy set, in which cylinders were attached at the ends to create more complex shapes. In this case, 8 hexagons of connected cylinders, which they called toruses. lined up and speared down the middle by a central hub shaft made of a cluster of 5 lines of cylinders. The toruses were connected to the hub shaft by thin crawl spokes, and the resulting object looked somewhat like a piece of agricultural machinery, say the arm of a harvester combine or a mobile sprinkler unit. Or like 8 knobby donuts, Maya thought, toothpick to a stick. Just the sort of thing a child would appreciate. The 8 toruses had been made from American tanks, and the 5 bundled lengths of the central shaft were Russian. Both kinds of tanks were about 50 meters long and 10 meters in diameter. Maya floated aimlessly down the tanks of the hub shaft. It took her a long time, but she was in no hurry. She dropped down into Taurus G. There were rooms of all shapes and sizes, right up to the largest, which occupied entire tanks. The floor in one of these she passed through was set just below the halfway mark, so its interior resembled a long Quonset hut. But the majority of the tanks had been divided up into smaller rooms. She had heard there were over 500 of them in all, making for a total interior space roughly the equivalent of a large city hotel. But would it be enough? Perhaps it would. After the Antarctic, life on the Aries seemed an expansive, labyrinthine, airy experience. Around 6 every morning, the darkness in the residential Tauruses would lighten slowly to a gray dawn, and around 6:30, a sudden brightening marked, quote-unquote, sunrise. Maya woke to it as she had all her life. After visiting the lavatory, she would make her way to Taurus D's kitchen, heat a meal, and take it into the big dining hall. There she sat at a table flanked by potted lime trees. Hummingbirds, finches, tanagers, sparrows, and lories pecked underfoot and darted overhead, dodging the creeping vines that hung from the hall's long barrel ceiling, which was painted a gray blue that reminded her of St. Petersburg's winter sky. She would eat slowly, watch the birds, relax in her chair, listen to the talk around her. A leisurely breakfast. After a lifetime of grinding work, it felt rather uncomfortable at first, even alarming, like a stolen luxury, as if it were Sunday morning every day, as Nadia said. But Maya's Sunday mornings had never been particularly relaxed. In her childhood, that had been the time for cleaning the one-room apartment she had shared with her mother. Her mother had been a doctor, and like most women of her generation, had to work ferociously to get by, obtaining food, bringing up a child, keeping an apartment, running a career. It had been too much for one person, and she had joined the many women angrily demanding a better deal than they had gotten in the Soviet years, which had given them half the money jobs while leaving them all the work at home. No more waiting, no more mute endurance. They had to take advantage while the instability lasted. "Everything is on the table," Maya's mother would exclaim while cooking their meager dinners. "Everything but food." And perhaps they had taken advantage. In the Soviet era, women had learned to help each other. A nearly self-contained world had come into being, of mothers, sisters, daughters, babushkas, women friends, colleagues, even strangers. In the Commonwealth, this world had consolidated its gains and thrust even further into the power structure, into the tight male oligarchies of Russian government. One of the fields most affected had been the space program. Maya's mother, slightly involved in space medical research, always swore that cosmonautics would need an influx of women, if only to provide female data for the medical experimentation. "They can't hold Valentina Tereshkova against us forever," her mother would cry. And apparently she had been right, because after studying aeronautic engineering at Moscow University, Maya had been accepted in a program at Baikonur and had done well, and had gotten an assignment on Novi Mir. While up there, she had redesigned the interiors for improved ergonomic efficiency, and later spent a year in command of the station, during which a couple of emergency repairs had bolstered her reputation. Administrative assignments in Baikonur and Moscow had followed, and over time she had managed to penetrate Glavkosmos' little Politburo, playing the men against each other in the subtlest of ways, marrying one of them, divorcing him, rising afterward in Glavkosmos a free agent, becoming one of the utmost inner circle, the double triumvirate. And so here she was, having a leisurely breakfast. So civilized, Nadia would scoff. She was Maya's best friend on the Aries, a short woman, round as a stone, with a square face framed by cropped salt and pepper hair. Plain as could be, Maya, who knew she was good looking, and knew that this had helped her many times, loved Nadia's plainness, which somehow underlined her competence. Nadia was an engineer and very practical, an expert in cold climate construction. They had met in Baikonur 20 years before, and once lived together on Novi Mir for several months. Over the years they had become like sisters, in that they were not much alike, and did not often get along, and yet were intimate. Now Nadia looked around and said, "Putting the Russian and American living quarters in different Tauruses was a horrible idea. We work with them during the day, but we spend most of our time here with the same old faces. It only reinforces the other divisions between us. Maybe we should offer to..." I don't know how to distinguish between the two women Russian voices. Let's see. What do you guys think Nadia sounds like? She deeper voice than Maya?
One is a soprano and the other is an alto. Go.
One is a soprano. Maybe we should offer to exchange half the rooms.
That was Nadia, for sure.
Maybe we should offer to exchange half the rooms. Arcady, wolfing down coffee rolls, leaned over from the next table. "It's not enough," he said, as if he had been part of their conversation all along. His red beard, growing wilder every day, was dusted with crumbs. "We should declare every other Sunday to be a moving day, and have everyone shift quarters on a random basis. People would get to know more of the others, and there would be fewer cliques. And the notion of ownership of the rooms would be reduced." "But I like owning a room," Nadia said. Arcady downed another roll, grinned at her as she chewed. It was a miracle he had passed the selection committee. But Maya brought up the subject with the Americans, and though no one liked Arcady's plan, a single exchange of half the apartment struck them as a good idea. After some consulting and discussion, the move was arranged. They did it on a Sunday morning, and after that, breakfast was a little more cosmopolitan. Mornings in the D dining hall now included Frank Chalmers and John Boone, and also Sax Russell, Mary Dunkel, Janet Bly-Levin, Ria Jimenez, Michelle Duval, and Ursula Cole. John Boone turned out to be an early riser, getting to the dining hall even before Maya. "This room is so spacious and airy. It really has an outdoor feel to it," he said from his table one dawn when Maya came in. "A lot better than B's hall." "The trick is to remove all chrome and white plastic," Maya replied. Her English was fairly good, and getting better fast. "And then paint the ceiling like a real sky." "Not just straight blue, you mean?" "Yes." He was, she thought, a typical American. Simple, open, straightforward, relaxed. And yet this particular specimen was one of the most famous people in history. It was an unavoidable, heavy fact, but Boone seemed to slip out from under it, to leave it around his feet on the floor. Intent on the taste of a roll, or some news on the table screen, he never referred to his previous expedition. and if someone brought the subject up, he spoke as if it were no different from any of the flights the rest of them had taken. But it wasn't so, and only his ease made it seem that way. At the same table each morning, laughing at Nadia's lame engineering jokes, making his portion of the talk. After a while, it took an effort to see the aura around him. Frank Chalmers was more interesting. He always came in late and sat by himself, paying attention only to his coffee and the table screen. After a couple of cups, he would talk to people nearby, in ugly but functional Russian. Most of the breakfast conversations in D Hall had now shifted to English to accommodate the Americans. The linguistic situation was a set of nesting dolls. English held all 100 of them. Inside that was Russian, and inside that the languages of the Commonwealth, and then the internationals. 8 people aboard were idiolinguists, a sad kind of orphaning in Myra's opinion, and it seemed to them that they were more Earth-oriented than the rest, and in frequent communication with people back home. It was a little strange to have their psychiatrist in that category. Though bilingual, he was very focused on France. Anyway, English was the ship's lingua franca, and at first Maya had thought that this gave the Americans an advantage. But then she noticed that when they spoke, they were always on stage to everyone, while the rest of them had more private languages they could switch to if they wanted. Frank Chalmers was the exception to all that, however. He spoke 5 languages, more than anyone else aboard. And he did not fear to use his Russian, even though it was very bad. He just hacked out questions and then listened to the answers with a really piercing intensity and a quick, startling laugh. He was an unusual American in many ways, Maya thought. At first, he seemed to have all the characteristics. He was big, loud, maniacally energetic, confident, restless, talkative and friendly enough after the first coffee. It took a while to notice how he turned the friendliness on and off, and to notice how little his talk revealed. Maya never learned a thing about his past, for instance, despite deliberate efforts to chat him up. It made her curious. He had black hair, a swarthy face, light hazel eyes, handsome in a tough guy way, his smile brief, his laugh sharp, like Maya's mother's. His gaze, too, was sharp, especially when looking at Maya. A matter of evaluating the other leader, she assumed. He acted toward her as if they had an understanding built on long acquaintance, a presumption which made her uneasy given how little they had spoken together in Antarctica. She was used to thinking of women as her allies, and of men as attractive but dangerous problems. So a man who presumed to be her ally was only the more problematic and dangerous, and something else. She recalled only one moment when she had seen further into him than the skin, and that had been back in Antarctica. After the thermal engineer had cracked and been sent north, news of his replacement had come down, and when it was announced, everyone was quite surprised and excited to hear that it was going to be John Boone himself, even though he had certainly received more than the maximum radiation dosage on his previous expedition. While the evening room was still buzzing with the news, Maya had seen Chalmers come in and be told of it, and he had jerked his head around to stare at his informant. And then for a fraction of a second she had seen a flash of fury, a flash so fast it was almost a subliminal event. But it had made her attentive to him. And certainly he and John Boone had an odd relationship. It was difficult for Chalmers, of course. He was the Americans' official leader, and even had the title captain. But Boone, with his blonde good looks and the strange presence of his accomplishment, certainly had more natural authority. He seemed the real American leader, and Frank Chalmers something like an overactive executive officer, doing Boone's unspoken bidding. That could not be comfortable. They were old friends, Maya had been told when she asked, but she saw few signs of it herself, even watching closely. They seldom talked to each other in public, and they did not seem to visit in private. Thus, when they were together, she watched them more closely than ever, without ever consciously considering why. The natural logic of the situation just seemed to demand it. If they had been back at Glavkosmos, it would have made strategic sense to drive a wedge between them, but she didn't think of it that way here. There was a lot that Maya didn't think about consciously. She watched, though, and one morning Janet Blyleven wore her video glasses into D Hall for breakfast. She was a principal reporter for American television, and often she wove her way through the ship wearing her vid glasses, looking around and talking the commentary, collecting stories and transmitting them back home, where they would be, as Arcady put it, pre-digested and vomited back into that baby bird consensus. It was nothing new, of course. Media attention was a familiar part of every astronaut's life, and during the selection process they had been scrutinized more than ever. Now, however, they were the raw material for programs magnitudes more popular than any space program had been before. Millions watched them as the ultimate soap opera, and this bothered some of them. So when Janet settled at the end of the table wearing those stylish spectacles with the optical fibers in the frame, there were a few groans. And at the other end of the table, Ann Claiborne and Sax Russell were arguing, oblivious to any of them. "It'll take years to find out what we have there, Sax. Decades. There's as much land on Mars as on Earth, with a unique geology and chemistry. The land has to be thoroughly studied before we can start changing it." "We'll change it just by landing." Russell brushed aside Ann's objections as if they were spiderwebs on his face. "Deciding to go to Mars is like the first phrase of a sentence, and the whole sentence says, Veni vidi vici." Russell shrugged. "If you want to put it that way." "You're the weenie, Sax," Anne said, lip curled with irritation. She was a broad-shouldered woman with wild brown hair, a geologist with strong views, difficult in argument. "Look, Mars is its own place. You can play your climate-shifting games back on Earth if you want. They need the help. Or try it on Venus. But you can't just wipe out a 3-billion-year-old planetary surface." Russell rubbed away more spiderwebs. "It's dead," he said simply. "Besides, it's not really our decision. It'll be taken out of our hands." "None of these decisions will be taken out of our hands," Arcady put in sharply. Janet looked from speaker to speaker, taking it all in. Anne was getting agitated, raising her voice. Maya glanced around and saw that Frank didn't like the situation. But if he interrupted it, he would give away to the millions the fact that he didn't want the colonists arguing in front of him. Instead, he looked across the table and caught Boone's gaze. There was an exchange of expressions between the two, so quick it made Maya blink. Boone said, "When I was there before, I got the impression it was already Earth-like." "Except 200 degrees Kelvin," Russell said. "Sure, but it looked like the Mojave or the dry valleys. The first time I looked around on Mars, I found myself keeping an eye out for one of those mummified seals we saw in the dry valleys." And so on. Janet turned to him, and Anne, looking disgusted, picked up her coffee and left. Afterward, Maya concentrated, trying to recall the looks Boone and Chalmers had exchanged. They had been like something from a code, or the private languages invented by identical twins. The weeks passed, and the days each began with a leisurely breakfast. Mid-mornings were far busier. Everyone had a schedule, although some were fuller than others. Frank's was packed, which was the way he liked it, a maniacal blur of activity. But the necessary work was not really all that great. They had to keep themselves alive and in shape, and keep the ship running, and keep preparing for Mars. Ship maintenance ranged from the intricacy of programming or repairs to the simplicity of moving supplies out of storage or taking trash to the recyclers. The biosphere team spent the bulk of its time on the farm, which occupied large parts of Taurus's C, E, and F, and everyone aboard had farm chores. Most enjoyed this work, and some even returned in their free hours. Everyone was on doctor's orders to spend 3 hours a day on treadmills, escalators, running wheels, or using weight machines. These hours were enjoyed or endured or despised, depending on temperament, but even those who claimed to despise them finished their exercises in noticeably, even measurably, better moods. Beta endorphins are the best drug, Michel Duval would say. Which is lucky since we don't have any others, John Boone would reply. Oh, there's caffeine. Puts me to sleep. Alcohol? Gives me a headache. Procaine, Davon, morphine. Morphine? In the medical supplies, not for general use. Arcady smiled. Maybe I'd better get sick. The engineers, including Maya, spent many mornings in training simulations. These took place on the backup bridge in Taurus B, which had the latest in image synthesizers. The simulations were so sophisticated that there was little visible difference between them and the act itself. This did not necessarily make them interesting. The standard orbital insertion approach, simulated weekly, was dubbed the mantra run and became quite a bore to every conceivable flight crew. But sometimes even boredom was preferable to the alternatives. Arcady was their training specialist, and he had a perverse talent for designing problem runs so hard that they often killed everybody. These runs were strangely unpleasant experiences and did not make Arcady popular among his victims. He mixed problem runs with mantra runs randomly, but more and more often they were problem runs. They would, quote-unquote, approach Mars, and red lights would flash, sometimes with sirens, and they were in trouble again. Once they struck a planetesimal weighing approximately 15 grams, leaving a large flaw in the heat shield. Sachs Russell had calculated that their chances of hitting anything larger than a gram were about 1 in every 7,000 years of travel, but nevertheless, there they were, emergency, adrenaline pouring through them even as they pooh-poohed the very idea of it, rushing up to the hub and into EVA suits, going out to fill the pothole before they hit the Martian atmosphere and burned to a crisp. And halfway there, Arcady's voice came over their intercoms. Not fast enough, all of us are dead. But that was a simple one. Others, the ship, for instance, was The ship, for instance, was guided by fly-by-wire system, meaning that the pilots fed instructions to flight computers which translated them into the actual thrusts needed to achieve the desired result. This was how it had to be, because when approaching a gravitational mass like Mars at their speed, one simply could not feel or intuit what burns would achieve the desired effects. So none of them were flyers in the sense of a pilot flying a plane. Nevertheless, Arcady frequently blew the entire massively redundant system just as they were reaching a critical moment, which failure, Russell said, had about a 1 in 10 billion chance of happening, and they had to take over and command all the rockets mechanically, watching the monitors on and an orange on black visual image of Mars bearing down on them, and they could either go long and skip off into deep space and die a lingering death, or go short and crash into the planet and die instantly. And if the latter, they got to watch it right down to the simulated 120 kilometer per second final smash. Or it might be a mechanical failure, main rockets, stabilizing rockets, computer hardware or software, heat shield deployment. All of them had to work perfectly during the approach. And failures of these systems were the most likely of all. In the range, Sachs said, though others contested his risk assessment methods, of 1 in every 10,000 approaches. So they would do it again, and red lights would flash, and they would groan and beg for a mantra run even as they partly welcomed the new challenge. When they managed to survive a mechanical failure, they were tremendously pleased. It could be the high point of a week. Once John Boone successfully aerobraked by hand with a single main rocket functioning, hitting the safe millisecond of arc at the only possible speed. No one could believe it. Blind luck, Boone said, grinning widely as the deed was talked about at dinner. Most of Arcadie's problem runs ended in failure, however, meaning death for all. Simulated or not, it was hard not to be sobered by these experiences, and after that, irritated with Arcadie for inventing them. One time, they repaired every monitor in the bridge just in time to see the screens register a hit by a small asteroid, which sheared through the hub and killed them all. Another time, Arcadie, as part of the navigation team, made an error and instructed the computers to increase the ship's spin rather than decrease it. "Pinned to the floor by 6 Gs, he cried in mock horror, and they had to crawl on the floor for half an hour, pretending to rectify the error while weighing half a ton each. When they succeeded, Arcadie leapt off the floor and began pushing them away from the control monitor. "What the hell are you doing?" Maya yelled. "He's gone crazy," Janet said. "He's simulated going crazy," Nadia corrected her. "We have to figure out," doing an end run around Arcadie, "how to deal with someone on the bridge going insane." Which no doubt was true, but they could see the whites of Arcadie's eyes all the way around, and there wasn't a trace of recognition in him as he silently assaulted them. It took all 5 of them to restrain him, and Janet and Phyllis Boyle were hurt by his sharp elbows. "Well," he said at dinner afterward, grinning lopsidedly as if he were growing a fat lip, "what if it happens? We're under pressure up here, and the approach will be worst of all. What if someone cracks?" He turned to Russell and the grin grew wider. "What are the chances of that, eh?" And he began to sing a Jamaican song in a Slavic Caribbean accent. "Pressure drop, oh pressure going to drop on you." So they kept trying, handling the problem runs as seriously as they could, even the attack by Martian natives or the decoupling of Taurus H caused by explosive bolts installed by mistake when the ship was built, or the last-minute veering of Phobos out of its orbit. Dealing with the more implausible scenarios sometimes took on a kind of surreal black humor, and Arcadie replayed some of his videotapes as after-dinner entertainment, which sometimes got people launched into the air with laughter. But the plausible problem runs, they kept on coming, morning after morning, and despite the solutions, despite the protocols for finding solutions, there was that sight, time after time, the red planet rushing at them at an unimaginable 40,000 kilometers an hour until it filled the screen and the screen went white, and small black letters appeared on it. Collision. All right. Let's call that good for tonight. We're working on part 2, and a lot of psychology going on that ship. We'll see what happens. Alrighty.